don't play chords that often, do we? I remember when I first bought my bass, my mom bought me this little Gibson bass, little Fender amp, and I got this chord chart. I'm like, what the hell is a chord chart for a bass? I was like, how do you play a G, you know? So that doesn't sound like Gene Simmons at all, you know? So I got my Kiss records, and I was like, what the heck is that? Well, I had the church guitar player, actually, because I grew up in this farm, in this little farming community in southern Minnesota, so like the church guitar player was like the only guy around, and he came out with his acoustic guitar, and he was kind of showing me, no, when it says G, that means you played the G, you know? When it says D, usually the bass player plays the D. So I kind of learned the fundamentals, like, okay, I'm the root guy. Okay, now it sounds more like my BTO records and stuff I was growing up on, you know? And, but I started to learn, especially in and I'm just doing the standard A440 here, you know, like just using the 1 and the 5, 5, right, or even minor. Just something to the 1-5, and just add this really nice, just kind of heaviness to certain chords when you land on them. And it's just a simple, effective way. It's kind of just a nice little seasoning during a riff or a piece of a tune. So why don't you play this thing, and I'm gonna kind of start with just using kind of a 1-5, and we'll split out into some arpeggios a little bit here to help to take the bass from being just a one-note instrument up to being a bit more of a melodic instrument, even in a rock setting. About that is all of a sudden the bass is the one doing the moving instead of the guitar. I composed a little thing to just kind of have the bass be the guy doing the moving, because I like listening to my Steve Harris and Yes and Rush records and stuff, and the bass is always moving. Like, well, how come they get to, you know, how come they're moving and I'm not, and I'm always having to hide behind sort of the static chords of the guitar. So I realized that, you know, there's just some simple little things like that. And again, a 1-5, it's very elementary, but it's effective, and it's really, again, it doesn't take a lot of notes to just make something that sounds pretty cool, you know. So I mentioned one thing as I was actually reading that story. Chris Giese was asking me about, you know, like, can you just kind of take like a pentatonic scale, which kind of works in blues and rock and roll, and it's, you know, kind of just a nice standard, you know, 5-note scale. As soon as you start adding half notes to it, or half tones to it, all of a sudden it starts to sound like metal, you know. Right, even then. Now, if you do a little music theory studying, which I recommend all bass players learn the notes on the neck, and then also learn that. You know, do a little, you know, again, you know, learn your majors, your minors, and once you start getting into diminished, that was something that we did a lot in our early thrash metal development, was we started using diminished stuff. You know, those kind of things that we're like putting in songs at lightning speed, you know, but all of a sudden it made it really like interesting, and it took it from being just straight like kind of pentatonic Black Sabbath rock, or Zeppelin rock, especially Zeppelin, so to speak, and it made it sound dark, and it made it sound evil and menacing and metal, you know, which is what, all of a sudden it was like, wow, we're creating something kind of cool here, you know. So I'm going to play a little something using some diminished licks that kind of goes beyond, you know, just the 1-5 thing of the chord into the diminished thing. So it's the NYC thing. Yeah.
Woo!
Getting those guitar players to follow the bass player for a change. You know what I mean? So, and it's just, again, it's kind of making things up and goofing off, and again, but stepping a little bit out of the box of just having to always think like, just kind of always linear, as far as just having to stay in the box of it's kind of your just either major, minor, or straight pentatonic type of stuff. So, does anybody have any questions or comments or insults or anything you might want to throw out on a... Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I've actually received 2 magazines this month with you on the cover.
Uh-oh.
And one was Bass Play Live.
Sure.
And the other one was Christian Musician.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering how you, on the road, were able to reconcile the two, because your music, I like what you had to say in the magazine.
Right.
I like a little more depth.
Yeah.
But I've played in
Well, we kind of make this like our church service right here.
Yeah.
That's a cool thing. Someone told me God's wherever you go. You don't have to always just be in a sort of a house of His, in order to honor that. So, look, I was born a Lutheran kid, when I was growing up in Minnesota, and a lot of my influences were musicians and people around the church. And over the years, I got called. Actually, it's funny. We were making a Megadeth record, the Risk album, in 1999 down in Nashville. And I went down there, and it's like everybody that I ran into was like asking me about my faith, and I thought, this is odd. Then I realized we're at the belt buckle of the Bible Belt, we're right in the middle of it, so I guess it makes sense. And the kind of contemporary Christian music scene was starting to really take off at that point. And so people started asking me about it, and I called them to my wife, and I said, man, it's like the Christian army just coming at me here down in Nashville, and she laughed, and she goes, that's funny, because the worship leader at church asked if you're home next weekend if you could sit in and play bass for him. And I thought, I started liking a lot. What I started realizing in some of the Christian music is that a lot of that was like, they were older guys, but they were also like former rocker guys who grew up and like me were starting family, got married, and I had little kids at the time, or, kind of, now it's my turn to be dad, and, started to take my family to church and that. But fortunately, it wasn't the old hymns and it wasn't that stuff, this old stoic music. It was like pretty hip rockin' stuff. I mean, bass players were cranking, guitar playing was really good. Melodically, it was very contemporary, and I always listened to what they called the JPMs, the Jesus per minutes. You know what I mean? Because initially I was like, "Hey man, chill on that stuff a little bit." I'm kind of cool with like U2, like Christian music. That's about as far as I'd want to go. But what happened is I said yes. I said sure, I'll sit in and play. And initially I just did it really just as a bass player because I grew up. I did my time in jazz band growing up, and I learned. Theory, and I learned how to read, and I'd play in our little annual swing band thing that we did at school, and so I learned how to read charts, and so all of a sudden reading these church songs were basically just lyric charts with chords over them. And again, it was the same kind of thing, it was sort of like a D with an F sharp bass, and I was all of a sudden I was having to like think musically again rather than just in a band with a bunch of guys slamming out riffs. Where we generally just look at each other's hands and go, what is that? That's how we talk to each other. We don't go, yeah, dude, it's the it's the G minor and the diminished F sharp. We don't do that. It's just dudes going, man, that sounds rad. What is that? And hit the record. Let's do that. So that's how we write, and that's the spirit of 4 guys in a band room just like this, churning out some music together. So working in the church, it started to just develop a whole other thing. And of course, I think anytime you're going to become who you're associated with, right? So that's how that whole thing developed for me. And I started getting involved in it. I started doing clinics like this for the Christian Musician Summit, and Abe Laboriel was one of my favorite bass players. Had played on a bunch of Christian records. I was like, man, check this dude's licks out. And in that setting, and it was cool. So. And I realized there was a lot of people, even in Los Angeles, guys who were playing in Sting's band and singers and various people that, on the weekends they were doing these church gigs. And in Nashville, a lot of guys were doing that. When they'd be recording, they'd be out touring, and then on the weekends they'd go in on Sunday and they'd even get paid and, to sit in and do the church gig and stuff. And I just found it was a cool thing. And I still do it, I still do it. I got involved in starting up a ministry thing and putting together some worship teams. And I started actually pulling people not in the church. I pulled like rocker dudes from outside the church in and said, hey, it's a cool hang. They're not going to be throwing Jägermeister at you. They won't be heckling you, at least not too bad, And you might get something a little more out of it, but more importantly, why don't you bring your chops in and let's kick this band up a notch, So that's kind of what my fusing of those two worlds has been about, And the Megadeth thing, I mean, you know, we're never. There's probably less of us satanic bands out there than you think. You know, it's like the Megadeth thing was never about that anyway. Even though there's a couple of tunes that kind of talked about that a little bit. I think most of us metal guys, probably there's some metalheads here. You know, we were never Satan worshipers. We're just kind of like looking into the abyss once in a while, going, "Ooh, that's kind of spooky." We're just on tour with Slayer for the last few months, you know, and even most of their songs, they're just writing. You know, I don't know. They didn't seem as bad as everyone made them out to be. But that's because I know them and they're pretty harmless guys, actually. Don't tell anybody that. Anybody else have the? Go ahead.
Listen, I saw you guys at Universal. Killed, absolutely killed. It was great show. I'm a guitar player, and I think you're one of the best bass players in metal. One of your signature riffs that you're most known for, obviously, is the intro to Peace Sells.
Peace Sells, right?
Is there any chance we can get you to play a little?
Sure. You know, it's interesting this year because when we went back. I recorded that with a BC Rich Mockingbird, which is, I even told my friend Bill of BC Rich, one of the most uncomfortable basses ever to play, right? But in the day, back in the 80s, it looked cool, you know, and my dad bought one for me when I was like 16. But it's interesting that because the way the thing sits and hangs and the neck is way out here, all of a sudden I got a Mockingbird to take out on the tour and I played it a bunch of times, and all of a sudden I realized that it's like, man, that's how come I can play that lick. It's actually harder to play on these more Fender-style basses because of where the strap buttons are. Because all of a sudden on that little skip thing right there, it's easy because your pinky's already right there. I barely play it, I'm kind of hacking through it. But the point was, all of a sudden, it made me realize, man, no wonder I've struggled with that on a couple of other instruments. I was thinking I was starting to suck pretty bad in my old age. You know, I was turning into a lesser bass player, you know, but I realized part of the charm of that was just that particular instrument that I'd played it on, which took me back to, you know, thinking about, you know, even as I'm playing here, I don't have any effects, there's nothing, even live the other night, it's just me playing straight right into that, one head and two cabinets. I mean, it's that exact same thing, right?
Really?
There. Yeah, and you know, everything's straight up at 12 noon on the tone settings, and I think the volume's on 2.
It's not huge, but there was tons of definition. You could hear every note you play live.
So it's like a lot of it, you know, gear is important, you know, I mean, it definitely is important to enhance what you do, but I tell you, more I've learned, you know, in all my years, which I chased gear and tried to do bi-amp and tri-amp and all these various things, and you know, I found that it's like, man, it's right here. This is really where it's at. The tone is really in your hands, and I know you hear people say that all the time. But I'm here to tell you, man, it really is. You know, and even as I'm playing here today, and it's a different stage, and I'm not playing with a band, I'm just playing some tracks. I got to kind of adjust things a little bit, and you know, and even as I'm picking, you know, I was always taught from my Mel Bay books years ago to put my thumb on the back. That's really how I learned. So after that Christian guitar player guy, the church guy, came over to my house, I was sitting there, using my Mel Bay Volume 1 and 2 books, which I highly recommend. I thought I did pretty good with them, you know. And you know, they just taught me to, you know, keep my thumb along the back, to put, you know, use as little of skin on the finger as possible, play right up toward the fret. You notice that way? What happened? Is that this? You got a back chord. Just, you know, just to kind of have this, make a really nice, precise, clear tone. And that also comes down to, you know, strap length. This goes back to your Peace Sells thing there, which is, you know, to, you know, finger player, think about it, if it comes from the upright, right? It's almost easier. In fact, they can almost have their straps lower, right? Because you're kind of doing more of that same thing. And you're ergonomically keeping your hands straight. It's one of the things that I found too is, as a pick player, I gotta sometimes have my bass a little higher so I can keep my hands straight, and also so that this doesn't get, because all of a sudden you get it too low and you just get that grindy, you know, it's that punk rock sawing thing going on, you know. And for me on the right hand, I really played I've also learned how to play guitar after I learned how to play bass, but I do the same kind of thing doing this metal stuff, which is really resting the palm of my hand back here on the bridge, you know, so I can kind of, right, I can kind of lift up and mute, and lift up and punch notes just the same as the guitar players would, right? And so that gives me the dynamics, and it puts me in control of the dynamics rather than I remember one tour I used a compressor because I saw other people using, wow, I gotta get a DVX compressor. It's the most annoying piece of gear I've ever used in my life. Because it was shutting me down all the time. I wanted to hit it hard, and it's like, man, there's no dynamics. So I realized, like, they're for these guys. They're for the front of house guys and for recording engineers. They need it so that if I'm pumping or popping things too hard, that it's not blowing out the PA speakers. So it's really a pro audio piece of gear, not really something that I found works good on the stage up here. So. Anybody have any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
How did you develop your picking technique?
You know, the picking technique was really, I mean, I'm not kidding you. Early on, you know, a guitar player can have a 50-watt amp and be blowing the doors off this place, right? But a bass player's got a 50-watt amp and can't even hear it. So you need like a 300, 500, or even like, 1,000 watts of power to really get over that. And when I was just starting out, I couldn't afford really big gear. You know, I remember I bought a Music Man. I think it was a 130-watt tube head and a little 212 cabinet. You know, and it cost a lot of money back in those days. I was just a young kid learning how to play, and I would play, and I could never. You could hear bass, right? But it wasn't punching through. So I grabbed a pick. You know. And all of a sudden, it had like a clarity in the tone. I was like, wow, I like that. And as I was playing in the band with the drummer and the guitars, I was like, wow, I can hear myself. And if I whack it a little harder, I can actually, get a little attitude behind it. And that's so it became kind of a survival technique, really, to start playing with the pick. And then once we started Megadeth, I realized that it's like a lot of these, there's a lot of notes and there's a lot of riffs and things are moving by pretty quickly, that it was just a lot easier to be able to jump in and play along. That way, kind of like that first tune, Holy Words, that I played, I can grab some of the riffs, And then I can also do some other just bass things. Because again, the riff was just... But I can kind of... If I thump along underneath of it, right, and all of a sudden, wow, I kind of got myself a bass line because I'm, picking up the guitar parts, but kind of keeping an undertow. So chicks will like it, right?
How about that? Yeah.
My wife reminds me all the time that because girls like to dance, they like to move their body and dance. That's why I played the bass, so I didn't have to dance, right? Because I was the guy too scared to ask a girl to dance, and you play the music, play music, and you don't have to ask girls to dance anymore, right? I get married to someone who likes to dance. And so it's funny, I remember being at a wedding one time and just going out on the dance floor, and I'm all timid and shy, and it really hit me, the different dynamics of especially of bass, of just it could be an AC/DC song, or it could be, Bust a Move, but how effective the bass is at just moving people's bodies, and that's the thing that people ultimately like, is it, obviously us, metalhead guys, we shake our heads and do that deal, but girls, they like to move and dance, and there's it's just a primal thing, and it was good education. Going to a wedding, of all things, just goes to show you can learn something in anything you do, that even musically, going to a wedding dance, hearing the bass, after all these years I've been playing this thing, hearing a whole different dynamic and thinking, maybe I should start to apply a little bit of that to how I play. And what it dawned on me wasn't I should play more notes. What it made me realize is I should be more selective in the notes I play and place them with the drums and in and around the riffs much differently. In fact, even this song that we did, this tune Sudden Death for the Guitar Hero 6 thing that just came out, it's not Bust a Move by any means. It's not a dance move number, but it definitely, there's at certain points there's a sparseness in what I played that I think was kind of more of that mindset that it's like, again, musical maturity isn't having to just show all your licks right out of the gate the first minute of the tune. It's being able to hold some back and being able to place things around a little bit to actually think more like a composer rather than just teenage bass player guy. You got a question?
I think your answer was about picking technique.
Okay, cool. I knew you had your hand up. So, hey, go ahead.
Can you tell us a little bit about the bass you're playing and your move back to 5-string, pretty much full-time live now?
Yeah, again, like I said earlier, I tried a bunch of stuff. I mean, I had some Petey gear, which sounded great. It just didn't sound good in the pocket with the Megadeth stuff. I checked out some GK gear, which I'd played over the years, and then, Mark and I